Welcome to this painting demonstration video featuring the beautiful sand dunes of Holywell Bay in Cornwall, UK. In this 1-hour painting demo, I'm going to go through the complete painting process with you, from selecting the scene, the painting itself, and then at the end, a little self-critique. My focus will be on creating a nice composition, achieving a sense of depth with the background, selecting a focal point or two, emphasizing shadow shapes, and enhancing contrast in values. So on a recent trip, I took loads of photos of the sand dunes at Holywell Bay. Just scroll through a few of them. And then when I review them, some of them I think maybe could be a bit of a challenge to make a watercolor painting out of them. Others maybe a little bit easier. So for example, this one here would be quite difficult. The composition is wrong, the horizon is too high. We've got those background cliffs there. That's the high contrast, those background cliffs, too far up above the top, and nearly 2/3 of the scene is taken up with the grassy banks of that sand dune. Some better ones might be, well, that's the one I'm going to paint, so I'll skip past that one. That's not too bad. This one's quite nice because we've got the light blades of grass silhouetted against the darker background, and the horizon is a little bit higher than the center line. That works quite well. We've got a sort of diagonal slant of the ridge going into the distance, a sense of depth as well. Look how soft those colors are, lighter values compared to on the right hand side. Yeah, so that's quite a good one. This one, not so good, too close to the action. I quite like the patterns, the little depressions in the sand there, the dry sand. And again, we've got the silhouetted light blades of grass against the darker shadow. But yeah, doesn't really grab me, that one. So I'll go back to the one we're going to do on this demo. So this is my chosen scene. As I say, Holywell Bay, quite a large area of sand dunes there, and it's fairly early in the morning, a summer's day, bright sunlight. The focus of this is really composition. The photograph is pretty close to what I'm going to paint, with the focal point, I think, of this clump here, and the blades of grass silhouetted against the lighter sky. Nice shadow shapes coming out from that focal point. The shadow here, almost like a fan pattern, going across, fanning out, and going down to that bottom right-hand corner. Some nice shadow coming in from the top left corner, presumably another clump of grass over there, and then sense of depth with the scene as well. The tricky thing here is that we've got sort of towards the background, we've got this lighter ridge of grasses here, and then they're silhouetted against a slightly darker ridge that's further away, maybe another 100 yards away or so. But I don't want to make that too dark to bring it forward, to make it look as if it's closer than this clump here. Also, as regards values, I quite like some of these blades of grass, the lighter ones catching the light, shining up, lit up against the darker background. My eye was attracted to this kind of sort of wishing bone shape of brightly lit grass there, and that shadow created as well. A tricky thing might be the crescent shapes created, I guess, by the wind, and the sand is quite dry there. But these shapes, they're sort of soft crescent shapes. How can my mind is working on how to try and capture that using watercolor. And then the sand itself, what color would you call that sand? Out of your palette of colors, how would you make this color. Is it yellow ochre? Is it a light yellow? Is it orange? I can see, the more I look at it, the more I can see different warms and cools. So for example, just below the grass, it looks quite warm there, more of a sort of yellow ochre. And then coming down into this middle area, that looks to me cooler. All right, maybe a bit of blue in there to cool that base sand color down. Lovely footprints as well, crisscrossing the scene. And then to the foreground, bottom left corner, I think that looks quite warm. The actual brightly lit areas are quite almost like a yellow ochre sort of color, and then the shady part of this side here, not the deep shadow, but the shady side of the sand dune, again quite warm, darker obviously than that soft edge. That's going to be quite tricky to get that right. So that's a challenge. Focal point, getting depth, composition, shadow shapes, colors of the shadows as well. Try and make those shadows interesting. Let's see how we get on. Materials I'm using for this painting, first of all, paper. It's Saunders Waterford 100% cotton. If you've never tried 100% cotton paper before, or if you suffer from maybe too absorbent a surface, drying times too fast, then give Saunders a try. So this cold press paper, 300 grams in weight, and it's 15 inches by 11 inches. I've got the board at a slight angle, which you'll notice when I put the wash down. Colours I'll go through as I go through the demo. The actual mix of colours. What I've got is my normal palette colours right from the top: neutral tint, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, spring green, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, cadmium red, light red, cadmium orange, cadmium yellow, then a few opaquish gouache colours running across the bottom right. First of all, getting in the drawing right as per my thoughts with the focal point and the kind of shape of the silhouetted blades of grass coming out from the clumps on the sand dune. Getting in some kind of indication of the shadow edges as well. Not all of the different shadow shapes, but just a general indication of the area of that shadow. Top left corner, there's one coming down from there as well. And then coming from some kind of clump over on the left, another nice shadow shape coming in from the left, kind of repeating that sort of angle and this fan of shadow coming out from the grass. So that's pretty much it for the drawing. A fairly simple drawing, not really drawing in every single blade of grass, every single minute detail, just trying to get in the main objects. After the drawing, I'm wetting the paper. Now, I don't often do this, but in this particular case, wetting the watercolor paper before I start is going to help me getting soft edges. Wetting the paper can create these nice soft edges, and the blending of colors is a little bit easier. So that's going to help me, particularly with the cotton-based paper. It's going to absorb it quite well and stay wetter longer. It's going to be particularly useful for creating some nice atmospheric effects and maybe some soft shadows. It's going to improve paint flow as well. Wetting the paper helps the watercolor pigment spread a little bit more easily across the surface, and that can result in a smoother gradient and transitions in the painting. And it's going to give me a little bit of a longer working time. I'm not sure exactly what humidity I'm working under, but if you're working in a sort of dry environment, then wetting the paper can be really useful. I know some artists, they actually wet the paper both sides. Of course, I've actually taped my paper down, so I can only wet one side. But below this paper, I've got a polythene sheet, and that's going to really help. It's just going to help things stay wetter longer. Right, so before my pre-wet paper dries, I'm going in with the sky, laying in initially a light yellow ochre wash at the horizon level. And I need to get a graded wash here, so a little bit darker at the top, lighter as I come down towards the horizon, and then laying in a little bit of cerulean blue, a little bit darker blue at the top, going over the masking tape I've got around the side. The brush I'm using is a Tintoretto mop brush, which I'm using quite a lot at the moment. It's quite a good mop brush actually, and good point to it. Good water retention capacity as well. This is a kind of medium one they do. It's a size 6 Tintoretto series 1407. So I'm just darkening the sky a little bit. As it's still quite damp, I can get away with it. But as you know, with watercolor, if it dries too quickly and I start applying paint on top, I'm going to get some nasty effects occurring. Now you might be able to detect that with a slight slight bit of a slight gradient on the board, the paint is just ever so slightly is going down the actual page, which is what I want it to do. Not too much, but that's the desired effect anyway. Darker at the top with that sky, darker at the top, lighter towards the horizon. And I've just lifted out the area of the light grass in the background. So I don't want that to bleed or travel too much. So it was just a little bit too wet. So I noticed that I could see the shine on the paper. So I just lifted off a little bit. And then now with a mix of a cool light green, trying to get in that grassy area in the background. So a little bit cobalt green, a little bit of yellow ochre. It's quite a good mix. Just try it out in a little area first, and then go over. Now the paper is still a little bit damp, so I'm going to get a few soft edges. We'll say, don't mind, that's what I really want to try and achieve with this. A longer time to work with the paint and those soft edges. As I come over to the right, that is a tiny bit closer to us, so I might go a little bit darker on that right hand side. And with an area like this, try and introduce a little bit of variation in the intensity of that colour. So as it's still damp, I can just drop in a little bit of extra colour in there. I will go in later on when it's a little bit drier and add in some shadows to create the clumps of the clumps of grass. Give the illusion of the clumps of grass with a shadow of a clump behind a clump in front. So there'd be a kind of progression, hopefully a sense of progression of clumps over that little ridge. Sand colour. Well, I have this gouache paint, bottom right corner. This is a light sort of sandy coloured gouache, and I can also use a little bit of yellow ochre. But I find that's I've been practicing a little bit on a few other paintings, I find that's quite a nice base color to create the color of the sand in this area. As I said in the introduction, there's I detect a little bit of coolness in the sandy area in the middle as it dips down where I'm going now, where I'm painting now. It's dipping down, it's going down a little bit before it comes back up towards us. So just a little bit of light blue there to create that coolness. Now this will all dry quite light, or it will dry lighter than it appears now. So I've got watercolor painters will know I need to sort of compensate for that. One, it's damp, I can be splashing in some extra color, a little bit of alizarin crimson in there. Just connect the fast sand with the grass. Again, getting that softer edge. Dropping in this cooler water might create a few little lighter areas in that grass. Continue on down. So it's worthwhile, any beach scene, sand scene. I find that sand is always going to be subtly different. So take a few minutes to observe the colours. And of course, with photographs, they can distort the colours, the actual colours. Nothing beats actually painting there on site. On this particular occasion, I couldn't. I was just taking photographs. So I have to go with the photo, but try and observe the subtle variations of colour in a sandy area. I'm just lifting off that level patch. I'm not sure if it was sort of footpath used by people. It's a popular dog walking area. When I was there, most of the people I saw were accompanied by a dog. It was quite early in the morning. Now, sand on the near side here, foreground, is going to be warmer, a little bit deeper than the sand in the middle area. So just change the intensity a little bit, burnt sienna. See how that goes. That might be a little bit too strong. I might need to wash or lift a little bit of that out before it dries. Apply that gouache again. I think it's quite nice getting that sort of opaque-ish quality to it that you get with gouache. Some people may frown on using gouache with watercolor in this way, but for me, it gives the desired effect. Again, over such a large area like this, I'm just changing the intensity and variation of colors a little bit, and with my brush strokes going in different directions there, just to, they might show up as the surface dries, might show up a little bit that kind of variation with this brushing, using the brush, going in different directions. Down to that bottom right corner, and then over to the left. Should have just enough of that mixture in that mixing well to cover this area. If there are little areas of the paper left unpainted, that doesn't necessarily matter. That could be, we could make that into something later on. Could be an object catching the light, or a stone or something like that, or a blade of grass. So not hypercritical to cover everything, but I do go right up to the edge. I like when that tape is removed, I'm going to get a nice white crisp border around the outside of the painting. So I can now just let it do its own thing for a bit. Now, before this near side dries completely, I need to think about this, trying to achieve with watercolor this pattern, these crescent shapes, like scallops, or I don't know what the shape, how you would describe the shape, but that quite pleasing pattern going down the length of the sand dune on the left hand side with these sort of softer, lighter areas, the crescent shapes, and then the shadow around it. Just going to lift off the top part of that sand dune. It was just a little bit too strong, so with a paper tissue, just in a few selected areas. It's a good idea to, if you do use a paper towel tissue, try and use one that's got a try and use one that's not like a rough surface. It's got a smooth surface, so that it does create a nicer shape when you lift off the paint from the paper. So pre-wetting the paper, having a sheet of polythene underneath the paper is going to help slow down that drying time. As you can see, there's still a little bit of a glimmer on the surface. So I've got time to think about my approach for these these crescent shapes on that left-hand side. Bit of alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue. Again, for the moment with this same Tintoretto mop brush. It's a synthetic brush. And I'm just waiting to pick the right moment. So I don't want the paper to be too wet so that the paint travels too much. So starting on the left-hand side, just try out a little area there. And of course I might need to make the lighter crescent shapes quite large in size, because the paint's going to travel with being a damp surface. Paint going on top of it, it's going to travel a little bit in a downwards direction because of this slight gradient on my board. I can, of course, lift off the paint in those lighter curved areas if I need to, but just getting in these basic shapes, to be honest with you, it looks like a total mess at the moment, but just persevering and hoping that it will come true in the end. I've never actually painted sand dunes like this before. In fact, I haven't painted many sand dunes at all. And of course, the principles here of painting the sand dune would be pretty much the same if it was a desert scene. This is a UK coastal scene, and probably a sort of scene very similar to many other sand dune areas in northwest Europe, the UK, and over in Holland, Belgium, France. Right, down to that bottom right corner. The actual ridge of this patch of the sand dune, the actual ridge is going to be covered with darker grasses as I progress. But first of all, these darker crescent shapes. Now, I've got a small flat brush. Synthetic. This is a Raphael Soft Aqua flat brush, maybe about 1 centimetre width, something like that. So not massive. I'm mixing up a darker, thicker colour now because I need to create a little bit more impact in the values. So again, on the left-hand side, a little trial. Maybe actually a lot of this area on the left-hand side will be covered with a shadow anyway. So if I do make a mistake, I can just imagine the shadows coming down a little bit further and covering that a little bit more. But just starting from, and because the paper's still down, I'm still getting that soft edge. Starting from the side of the crescent shape that's further away from the light, just dragging it downwards, mainly to that bottom right corner. I also need to make sure that these shapes are not too repetitive and they don't look too false. I need to have them going in different directions and maybe not, strictly speaking, a curved shape either. Some of them do go in a little bit of a different direction, a different angle to the others, I guess, as however they were created, I guess, by the wind action. It's sort of creating little eddy currents as it's going around the grass, and it goes off at funny little angles. So it's going to create that kind of random effect. And I think it's just beginning to look a little bit better, that light, the soft light, the soft shade, using a small flat brush like this. Now I could have used my mop brush with a flat edge, could have used that, but I think this is slightly easier, a small flat brush like this. It's actually, the paper's starting to dry a little bit in the bottom right corner, I think. So I might need to be quite quick with this kind of technique here. Over on the right hand side, a lot of that area is going to be covered with a shadow, so I don't need to apply this technique right over to the edge of this area. Just the part where it's sort of in semi-sunlight and not in that deep shadow. Continue on down that bottom right corner, drag the brush over the edge of the paper on top of the tape for continuity, so I don't get that sort of funny border appearing along the edges. So it is actually sort of a thicker application. Now, those grasses towards the background, same brush, and just a little flick from the base of those grasses, not too dark, and I mustn't go too dark with these shadows because that would of course bring it too far forward. So just trying to judge it right, okay, with that value. Just a little flick up, and hopefully we've got the feeling of those soft, light green, cool green grasses. There's a little trail of grasses along the base, just above what I think might be a sort of footpath. And if I can see within my first when I applied those greens, first of all, if I can see a slightly lighter area, then I can go beyond it and put shadow around it to try and emphasize that the light against the dark, as I've just done there with a couple of clumps in the middle. I've also got to think about the direction of the sunlight. I forgot to say that the sun is, it's obvious, the sun's coming from the top left, coming from the left. So try and get maybe a little bit more shade on the right-hand side of objects as well. I think it's quite effective at doing things like this, and it's actually quite a soft brush, soft aqua. I mean, it's similar to many other makes. I mean, the Tintoretto, I guess, is a similar sort of hair. The Princeton Neptune is similar. Escoda do some as well. The synthetic, very soft synthetic hairs for their mop brushes. What's the other one I've used? Da Vinci Casanio as well. So they're all kind of similar, similar sort of brushes as regards their effects. Now background, not too dark with the background. Bit of blue in there. It's actually in the photo. It is actually quite green. It's quite green in the photo, so don't want to go too green. I've elected to go with more of a blue shade of green, and again using this flat brush, going pretty close to that clump, maybe leaving just a little bit of light above the green grass where the sunlight is just catching a few blades. Use the fingertips to blend the two together so it's not too perfect an edge. There's a little bit of imperfection on that edge, which I think will look a little bit more natural. But hopefully that sort of blue shade, the furthest background, that, fingers crossed, and it will dry a little bit lighter, of course, but hopefully that will push that back. A little bit of a shadow here for a few clumps of grasses, and with the very corner of that flat brush, add in a few little specks of grasses here and there, just to make it appear a little bit more natural, a bit more of the texture of that far area. So next will be a little bit more definition to the left-hand side, and some footsteps in the lighter sandy area. Not all of them, otherwise it might be just a little bit too much and too distracting if I put in every single footstep, but just an indication of a few, creating maybe a little bit of a story of people going around walking their dogs and going across the scene in different directions. And those footprints will be a little bit larger on the right hand side and down towards the bottom right corner, and smaller, a little bit shallower, a little bit thinner towards the distance, maybe a little bit lighter as well. Just a very light touch of the brush. I'm using the Tintoretto mop brush again, which has got quite a good point to it. I've had it a few months, and sometimes with mop brushes you find they start off with a very good point, and then you can sometimes, even with good quality brushes, you can sometimes then lose the middle hairs of that brush. You're going to lose that vital part, the point of the brush. But actually with this Tintoretto, I think I've only lost one hair in the last few months. I use it on a fairly regular basis, so I'm quite pleased with it so far. And in this case, with these little footprint marks, ideal for just creating those very small little areas to indicate the footsteps across the sand. Just testing for how dry the paper is on that right-hand side. Sorry, on the left-hand side, because I'm going to go in on the left with the darker grasses very shortly. While the surface is still quite damp, with a small synthetic brush, I can just emphasize a few of those crescent shapes just to make them a little bit lighter. If the edge is too soft, I can harden up the edge a little bit. So the paper is drying slowly, but just a little bit damp still. And I can then go in with this synthetic brush and just lift out a few areas. Synthetic brush is ideal for this. If it was a very soft brush, it might not have the stiffness to lift off the paint. It needs to be a little bit of toughness to the brush to get it right. Next will be the grasses then, and I've got to make sure that the sky is quite dry because I do want a hard edge appearing for those grasses. And I'm using a rigger brush. This is from Lebenson. It's quite a nice rigger brush. I think the hairs are about an inch long. Gives a very fine line. Holds a fair amount of paint, and so it's pretty well loaded, this brush, and just dabbing in a little bit to start my clump off. Where the blades are coming from, and then just radiate them out. Just drag that blob of paint out to create these blades. With these little blades of grass, I want to try and make it look as natural as possible. So I just need to be observant of that and the spacing of the grasses and going in different directions, different heights of grasses as well. So these are going to be now silhouetting, creating some form to that left-hand side, going over to the right. Phrygian green, so quite a dark green, a little bit of yellow ochre where some of the blades you've got kind of a mixture at this time of year, sort of a mixture of fresher, greener growth, and then maybe some of the older grasses that are dying off. So there's a kind of combination of yellowy grasses and greener grasses, depending on, I guess, depending on how stressed it is or how much, how little rain there's been. Same technique then as before, blob of paint and then just dragging it out with a fine rigger brush, trying to get fine lines, as random as possible. Sometimes doing this fairly quick will actually make it more random. Than the more you think about it, the more the more regular the grass can appear, there's spacing and there's size and so on. I think if I did it really quickly, then it'd be a lot looser in appearance. And also a few little dabs of paint beyond where the grasses are. Maybe there could be, well, it might just give a sense of movement of the grasses, and perhaps a few sort of flower heads as well. Another patch of grass here. Some of this area may be covered with shadow. Bit of neutral tint to go darker, yellow ochre. Lightly touching the surface, dragging those blades into the sky. A little bit further down. Neutral tint to go darker. You could always use Payne's grey if you haven't got neutral tint. Virgin green, neutral tint. It's going to give a really dark green. Another option for getting a dark green is using the cad yellow with neutral tint, or cad yellow with Payne's grey. That can get a nice dark green as well. It's fairly thick, my consistency of paint here, not too wet, not too much water in the mix. Need to go a little bit darker against the blue of the furthest hills. Neutral tint. That's going to show up against that lighter green. Just following the ridge, the edge of this sand dune with this pattern of grasses, and they sort of get a little, these patches of grass get a little bit thinner, more sparse as we go down to the bottom right corner. Just varying the colours, coming a little bit closer to me as well with some of these grasses coming. Need to have a few little blades of grass, a few little smaller clumps of grass over to the left, not just purely on this edge here. This area will, so I put a lot more paint on the brush here. This area will be partially covered with some darker shadow, so don't have to be too careful with the brush marks. Just going back over that area to fill in some of the gaps, just make it a little bit more solid at the base of the clumps. And there's not a lot of paint on that brush right now, so that creates some very, very thin, very fine lines, very light lines as well, because there's not much paint. So giving the effect perhaps of grasses just a little bit further round the corner, just protruding up above the ridge there. So time for some shadows now. Back to the mop brush and something dramatic. So this shadow colour, ultramarine blue, bit of alizarin crimson, and just starting in that top left corner, just create a little test. And also with these shadows, we're also indicating the surface of this sand dune as well, the little sort of peaks and troughs of the surface and little indentations. There's little gap in there, little sort of indentation there between the two clumps. So that this sort of brush with the brush shape is quite good for creating the shapes of shadows that I want going down the dune. Just a little bit of a flick, and we've got that sort of very thin shadow going down the dune. Try and connect these different shapes as well. So as long as the brush has got a good point to it, I could actually have done this with a rigger brush, or if you've heard of them, a dagger brush or a sword brush, because they can hold quite a lot of paint, and they've got a good point to them as well. A few shadows for some grasses yet to be painted in, so I've actually done the shadows first. Right, my main focal point of grass here, and try and get a nice shadow shape coming out from that. Connect. I'm always thinking about connecting these different shapes, rather than having things sort of too much on their own, standing out a bit too much. Cooler shadow, blue, cobalt blue. just a little flick, just little flicks, mainly from top left to bottom right in direction. Sorry, my hand is covering what I'm doing there, but you can hopefully see the results. Quite a solid patch of shadow just below that clump. Continue on down to that shadow, down to the bottom right corner. And go stronger with that shadow. So it's really a mix of ultramarine blue, cobalt blue if I want to go a little bit bluer, and then alizarin crimson. The blues from Mark Jackman are really intense. I do like the, I think my favourite is the cobalt blue. When I put tabs of that into a shadow, it really makes the shadow pop. Right, so very good edge on this brush, and just dragging in lots of these sort of shadows of the grass blades, dragging them down to the right hand side. Check every time I'm picking up the paint, I'm checking the point on my brush, just making sure I've got a good point and or a good edge to it to get these fine lines. Just lightly touching the surface. Don't want too much of a dry brush marker. There's got to be just the right amount of moisture in the brush. Bit of cobalt blue picked up. Connect with the grasses. Fewer shadows as I come down to the bottom right. You can see a little bit more clearly now my technique. So I'm resting the palm of my hand against the paper and then just almost swinging the brush in that sort of downward direction. And then here is my little angular, that sort of wishbone shaped grass I mentioned. A few more blades of shadows of the blades of grass. Create that fan shape by a few angles just going over to or down into that bottom left corner. So while that's drying, I do need to just try a little bit. This may not work, but try and add in just in the background grasses, just at the tops of the blades of grass, there are some, this might be too much detail now, what I'm doing, but using that gouache paint, just creating a little bit of a lighter band to the tops of the grasses. The danger is that this might just give too hard an edge at the bottom of these marks I'm making. I want it to be a soft edge, so this may or may not work, but I'm just going for it anyway. Sometimes you can observe an area too much, and you then get really captivated by the detail, and really that background. I do need to be very careful not to overdo it. Of course, I can use the finger just to work in that gouache paint just a little bit more. They do tend to dry a little bit faster than watercolor, so I need to be quite quick if I want to just merge that color a little bit. Using a bit of lavender now and cerulean blue to add in a few highlights in that shadow area. May not show up too much now, but it will dry a little bit darker, tiny bit darker later on. And Viridian Green was with the same flat brush, Viridian Green and neutral tint, just to emphasize some of the darker areas of the shade a little bit more. So quite a thick application. Viridian Green, neutral tint, very dark green, very thick, not much water on the brush. A little bit more, bottom right corner, pick up a bit of water if it's too dry. Just a few little shadows using the edge of that flat brush, creating a bit of a softer look in that bottom right corner. Some of the nearby footprints could have a tiny little bit of a darker shadow on the left-hand side of them, just to create more of a feeling of a depression. Same flat brush, darker, thicker, darker paint, neutral tint, creating these darker shadows in a few places. back to the small rigger brush and the blades of grass that are creating those isolated little shadows that I made earlier. And they're cutting across. They're growing, I guess they're growing out at right angles to the surface, but they're going to cut across those shadows. So again, another way of connecting those shapes, just making it a little bit more natural looking by the randomness of these little bit patches of grass growing out of the dune. I'm constantly looking back at the photo for some inspiration or guidance where some of these little blades could be. But I need to make sure I put blades where these shadows are. So top left, so where the shadow is, top left corner, connect that with a little blade of grass. Bit more lavender. Which is quite opaque, going in again, quite thick. It's still fairly damp, the darker areas of shadow, so I can just get a fairly soft edge with that lavender. Needs to be a few darker blades of grass here. That's going to show up more against that darker background, and the grassy bank in the distance. Again, we're connecting the different areas. A few little patches of paint beyond the grass could be, well, as I say, just give a sense of movement. Could be a few flower heads to the grass. Well, I've got this brush. I can put in a few little spots here and there. Little bits of debris in the sand. Just makes it a little bit more natural looking. I now need to make sure the area, the paint, the surface is completely dry before I go in with some lighter white gouache to create those, just a few blades of grass that's catching the light, and then that will be pretty much it. So make sure it's completely dry. And in this process, if the paper was buckling a little bit because it was been damp for quite some time, and with that polythene underneath it, It will dry flatter. The surface will go flatter again, which is another benefit of using the hairdryer, just to speed up the whole process. I think you've got to be careful in that using a hairdryer, that is going to make the surface quite warm. So if you are going in with paint quite quickly after using the hairdryer, the surface might be quite warm, and it will dry quicker than you think. So just need to be careful of that. So just a little bit, using the rigger brush again, white paint, white gouache paint, permanent white, and trying to judge that it's a little bit of a trick to get the consistency of the white paint just right. Not too thick. You don't want it too thick, otherwise you end up with dry brush marks. Not too thin, not too much water, otherwise it goes quite sort of milky and it dries a lot darker, and you end up on a thicker line, you end up with this sort of milky line and with a white rim where the pigment has sort of dried out and it's sort of traveled a little bit, and you get that sort of weird effect. So yeah, you need to judge it just right. It's sort of pasty in consistency. So just a few blades of grass in here, and thinking about, well, observing the photo again and thinking about the random direction of these marks. And a few strategic blades coming out at right angles to the surface. A light line. Here's this wishing bone sort of grass or whatever it was sticking out, that I don't know whether that's another focal point. I'm not 100% sure, but it was a thing when I saw the photo. It was the thing I looked at first of all. That just that one little blade of grass going in a funny direction, and just caught my eye. A few more lighter blades of grass, again, right angles, light against the darker background. Creates that little bit of extra interest and impact. A few extra blades, lighter blades down the bottom right corner, which, to be honest, I'm not really noticing too much, but I just need to, for continuity, just need to continue it on there. A few more in the middle here. Across the darker area, that's all, of course, that's all nice and dry now. Couldn't have done that while the paint was still quite damp. And then when I'm done, we'll go into a little bit of a critique of the painting. A few more little extra specks down that bottom left corner. Not much paint on this brush now. As I say, gouache, it does dry quite quickly, so you might need to keep your eye on things. See, it's quite dry there, not creating much of a dark line. As always, the trick is knowing when to finish. And I think I'm about done. Quick review then. Holywell Bay, sand dunes, lovely part of the world, and these beautiful shapes of sand dunes. I picked out one of my many photos from a recent trip. As I say, some of them I dismiss, and some I think might make quite a decent composition, quite a decent painting. I chose this one. I like the angle. I've made more of a focal point of the clump of grass, sort of that towards that top left corner, and capitalizing on the dark blades of grass against a lighter sky. Thinking about shadow shapes as well. These lovely shapes and marks coming across the scene, and the color of those shadows also I elected. I might have gone a little bit overboard with the blue, but I quite like it from an artistic point of view, and adding a bit of just something extra to those shadows. I did touch up a little bit this top left corner. I think those shadows in the top left corner, they just needed, just really, don't know whether you noticed that, but I've just softened those lines up a little bit more. They were just a little bit too hard, those shadows up there, and also a little bit in there as well. The crescent shape, I think that sort of turned out all right. I've got the feeling of that sort of funny pattern created by the wind, I guess, going down that side of the sand dune, and the light as it's coming up fairly early in the morning, as it's coming up, just catching certain little areas, those little ridges there. Background, quite happy with the background. With hindsight, I wouldn't have used that gouache. I think it looks a little bit, to be honest with you, it looks a little bit messy along that ridge of light green grass. But with the flat brush, fairly pleased with the feeling of those mounds of grass. See there, that area there, using that sort of whitish gouache paint. I should have left it. Should have left it more like, that looks better. This looks better down here. It sort of pushes it back to a nice soft edge. I was just going with too much detail. The subtle variations in color in the sand. So light, just underneath that grassy back, and then this big patch in the middle, fairly cool in the distance, random footprints across that, and then warmer on that left-hand side. And then playing on the contrast again, the lighter blades of grass, a little bit of white gouache, trying to judge the thickness of the paint as well. Also, some of the darker blades of grass, let me just see if I can find one, like this one here, right in the middle. So I did that darker blade of grass, so the shadow went in first, then the dark blade of grass. So I just took the liberty of adding in a little bit of highlight on the left-hand side, just to make that pop a bit more. Yeah, I've done that with a few of them. Just a little bit of, if there was a light mark, maybe just to strengthen it, add a little bit of shadow on the right-hand side or vice versa. A dark mark, make it add a little bit of highlight on the left-hand side. Yeah, so fairly pleased with it, apart from the maybe just a little bit too much detail on the background there, but fairly pleased with it. Maybe could have covered up some of these little gaps here. Might be just too many of those lighter areas. But in essence, I've captured the feeling of the place, how barren it is, these beautiful sand dunes, the shapes of the grasses, these lovely shadow shapes as well. So I hope you like that, and I'll catch up with you on the next video. Thanks for watching.